Welcome, Dr. Krista Fisher. Thanks for joining us here on the Picking Up Rocks podcast. I've been really excited personally to get your perspective on this and unpack a recent study and report that's come out from your wings. So welcome. Where does this find you today?
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm really looking forward to the conversation as well. I'm in Melbourne, Australia. I'm actually at my work Movember headquarters, so you can see some of the posters and merch behind me. So it's good.
Yeah, it's apt. I think it's really good to get the horse's mouth. You've been deep in research and there's been a paper that's come out. I was hoping you'd give us the bird's eye view for the ones who haven't been aware. It's young men's mental health in a digital world. Sort of top line what that research is, and then we're looking for this conversation to go into some of the media bits and what falls off the back end of this. There's some data really laying it bare there. It was a massive effort to get it to where it is, and kudos to the team. But yeah, could you give us a highlight?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. So we've been hard at work for really 12 months deep in this world that is the digital world of young men, really. And the report that you referenced, Young Men's Health in a Digital World, that came out about a month ago. And really, what that research was data from 3,000 young men aged 16 to 25 in Australia, the US, and the UK. And our goal and aim for that research was to understand from young men's perspectives and hear from young men's experiences about the masculinity influences that they're engaging with online, and really ask some kind of big questions. How often are they engaging with these masculinity influences, and how are the voices that they're listening to online shaping their health, well-being, and relationships? And, it was a big piece of work and it covered a lot of things, but it made a lot of momentum, and I think really cut through, especially in the media and some mental health, but also violence prevention spaces, because there is increasing conversation about young men's digital worlds, the impact of social media on young men, but also young people, and also came at a time where it was just after the release of Adolescence, which, for any listeners who don't know, is a hit Netflix TV show, which, probably about 6 weeks after its release, I think had 114 million views. So it was really timely, and managed to tackle this issue, but also conversation, in what we hoped was a really nuanced way to start to, I guess, walk the walk, of what we always say, that you can't have a conversation about young men without young men. And that was what we were able to do with this research and the report and findings.
Hmm. And that's what's so timely about that with the adolescents, and then like that Netflix series coming out and different PMs from different nation states, suggesting to wheel it out. And there's been, pushback on that, and whether it's a negative or positive, but the conversation was there. And I think that's what's so key to lay some of the groundwork for ears and eyes and hearts to be open to this report landing the way it did. I don't know if it would land this well, say a year ago.
I don't think it would have. That's such a good point. We were saying that. I mean, I hope that we would have been able to contribute to that shift, but it felt very much like our public was primed to starting to, or desiring, answers as to how this is impacting young men as well.
Yeah, really are. Because we've just come past, like, for people who haven't been, in the Andrew Tates and the different sort of ideas of what manosphere is today for young men, sort of navigating it. It's a quagmire, to say the least, and the report does a really good job of sort of lifting the hood and sharing some numbers around why young men, or where young men are looking to get the information, and that's laid bare in there. And it's pretty striking around how many are turning to influencers or people online, sort of explaining what it is to be, in a very simple recipe formulae way, a young man. And so I think off the back of that work, and it's funny how life works like that with sequence, off the back of adolescence was very simple in its own way and isolating for some, but striking in what it was. And it laid bare off the back of a horrible incident in the UK. So it had that basis, like all good fiction in truth. But I was hoping to kick us off, because I would recommend you, we had a chat prior to this for all transparency, and you've done a really great conversation with another organization, another fella, on a podcast. It's called The Meaning of Men. I recommend anyone who wants to dive in there on the report to listen to that as well. So shout out there to both of you laying it bare there. But picking up from what's in there, I was hoping you could chat a little bit about the difference of the digital moment, because you say in that conversation and around, like, there isn't that much of a change around what young men are facing to what they've faced previously, but there is a difference that it's digital.
Yeah. It might be helpful too to just give a quick summary to the listeners on, I guess, some of the key takeaways from the report and the research too. Hopefully they will be encouraged and inspired to go and read the report. But just for the purposes of today's conversation, you touched on it before, but the biggest finding for us was actually how mainstream masculinity content and masculinity influences now are. So in our global sample of 3,000, 63% of them said that they were regularly engaging with one or more masculinity influencer. So that's why we are now pushing for a change in our language. The manosphere and Andrew Tate, as you referenced before, are often our go-to examples in public and media discourse around young men's digital worlds when we want to label or point to very clear examples of this type of content and what we're speaking about. But that isn't the case now. It's a lot of the ideas and content and influences that once gained traction and gained momentum in closed, fringe, and extreme radicalized online communities a decade, almost 2 decades ago, and now slowly molding and permeating men's lifestyle and culture content in a really mainstream way. So that was what we were able to uncover. The second big finding was that when we asked young men to complete the survey, at the very start, we asked them to select from a list of masculinity influences who they're regularly engaging with online. And that allowed us to create 2 groups of young men who are regularly engaging with these masculinity influences. So that's 63%. And the remaining amount of young men who are regularly on social media but not regularly engaging with content about masculinity, about gender, and about topics that are specific to men and young men. So then we compared these 2 groups on physical health outcomes, mental health outcomes, and also their attitudes towards relationships, their ideas about gender roles in families and communities and workplaces, and also their experiences dating. So the second key finding that I want to highlight is the differences between those young men engaging with masculinity influences regularly and those who aren't, in that those who are regularly watching masculinity influences were more optimistic and more hopeful about their personal circumstances and the social circumstances of young men over the next 5 years. They said to us that they were watching these masculinity influences because they found them motivating, inspiring, and entertaining. And, there was that clear evidence of young men who are watching these masculinity influences acting upon their advice. 38% of young men who watch these masculinity influences said they had actioned influencers' advice. Now, when we talk about mental health, young men who were watching masculinity influences, despite reporting feeling more optimistic and hopeful about their personal and social circumstances, actually were faring worse on their mental health outcomes relative to young guys who weren't watching these masculinity influences. So they had higher levels of worthlessness, restlessness, and hopelessness. Now, when we look at risk taking behaviors as well, we also saw higher levels of steroid use, of testosterone injections, of restrictive eating, of exercising whilst injured in young men who are watching these masculinity influences. And in terms of their experiences dating, a lot of young men watching these, more young men watching these masculinity influences had poor experiences dating. They were citing unique frustrations, believing that women were only after high value men, that women and men had different attitudes and values around dating. And more broadly, there was more kind of pessimistic views or attitudes towards women amongst young men watching these masculinity influences relative to young men who weren't. So these ideas and narratives that women use feminism to keep men down, that women don't care about men, that women should be kind of restrained to their traditional roles as wives and mothers, that had very high agreement amongst young men watching these masculinity influences, and higher agreement in those watching masculinity influences relative to those who weren't. So
Mhm.
that's kind of a bird's eye view and very, I was going to say quick summary, hopefully quick, but still in-depth summary of some of the key takeaways.
Yeah, and there's so much in there. Thanks for going around and coming through from the top. But yeah, that report is readily available and has been viewed and will continue to be so in terms of the data and what's been revealed and some of the stories that are captured in there.
Mm.
It's it's pretty amazing. One thing that struck out is really where people. Well, one thing that really struck me that I thought the study was great was just showing that young men are really looking for answers. I feel like there was a big, maybe it was just in my worldview, but sort of idea that young men were complicit or complacent in sort of trying to find
Mhm.
answers for self
Mhm.
help or what that was, and trying to figure out who they are and what they are, and that there was a real void in that space, and that just hasn't been serviced. And you can really see that in the data that you know influencers have found that space and have filled it, and algorithms have fueled it as sort of information has continued to filter in there. And you're so right, it's not just the Tates, but it was incredible to just watch that rise of an individual get to where they were and what they did
Mhm.
and what's happened and transpired from there. But yeah, that real willingness and want to sort of figure out what's going on in their worlds
Mm.
is I think a really positive sign. But the challenge and the baton's been handed to the ones who want to pick it up and be like, well, how do we give some information that's maybe counter to sort of being really designed by an algorithm that incites rage, to be perfectly frank.
Yeah,
The one thing that I wanted to
100%.
ask was, what have you found in terms of how this report's been picked up? Is there anything been striking that
Mm.
you and the team are like, oh, didn't expect that to sort of get as much coverage or as much notice?
We really wanted to approach conversations about the report in a way that brings more nuance rather than feeding into alarmist discourse, which is really understandable when we're talking about some of the really extreme content and extreme examples of masculinity influences. And I think we were able to achieve that level of nuance. I mean, you and I definitely having a nuanced conversation about the positives and negatives. But I still think that's something that is very difficult to cut through when people aren't emerged in these worlds or in these platforms in the same way that a young man might be, or as myself as a researcher who has a dummy TikTok account as an 18-year-old boy is. You can't really see the way that all of these influences and all of these masculinity oriented ideologies kind of converge and intersect with one another, and the way that we can't just bucket things or black and white label things as good or bad or divisive versus, uh, non-divisive influences. They converge and they compound one another, and that is also a product of the way that the algorithm works and what content gains traction and cuts through in a very saturated economy and space. So I think that we still have a while to go and a way to go to help other people, especially maybe older people, parents, caregivers, really understand the unique intricacies of how that content is delivered to young men, but also the waves that they go through and the ways that content is pushed to them in certain ways. And I think that once we can highlight that and bring better visibility to those experiences, that ultimately does help a population understand, have really productive and helpful conversations about this that brings young men in and not just shuts them away or others them, and then allows us to start thinking about interventions and solutions that promote healthier social media use or healthier displays of masculinity that's actually going to engage, that's actually going to resonate, that isn't just researchers or specialists developing an intervention over here and then wanting young men to get to where we are. We need to meet them where they are, not where we want them to be.
Yeah, it's so well said, Krista. And you're also hitting on something that's just across society wide, and that's just that we're all getting fed very niche content or very individualized feeds wherever you are, and it's sort of, I don't know, by design or the way that we engage with things. It's sort of, the incentive is there to just keep you engaged, and how that works is there's room for improvement. Let's say that. I help my partner run her perfume business, and we run ads on it. So like I understand the model there, and what works is when comments are really going off, and if it's inflammatory comments, people stop and look. You can see that it's like almost like a car accident on a road. People rubbernecking. It speaks something. I don't know
Yeah.
if we want to fully accept in humanity, but there's something there, and it seems that we're getting a few traffic jams online, and it goes across sector and across interest groups. So it's not like it's unique problems that young men are facing,
Yeah.
but I don't think the awareness has been there for how they're facing it, and a
Mm-hmm.
plethora of sort of issues that are going on, and maybe how they're feeling, and maybe they have been a group that haven't been the best at explaining that.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
And
There's
it's
two facets to it. There is why the content is being amplified, which I agree with you isn't just a unique or gender specific issue for young men, but there's the secondary facet about why it's resonating with young men, why
mm,
these narratives and why these ideologies are resonating with young men. And that is gender specific. That is also moment specific because of the social and political climate that we're in. Um, mm,
yeah, and I think we're getting to that piece where it's, how do we explain that? At the top, I sort of alluded to it. What's so different? It's like young men have always been trying to figure out, and young women, young people always trying to figure out who they are. But what's so different now that it's digital, and why is that so hard for maybe older gen, anyone outside of that space, to understand and make this moment so unique?
mm.
And you're speaking to that with that feed. I don't think people fully like you
Mm.
can't unless you have a dummy account or you spend a lot of time
Mhm.
feeding your algorithm to suggest that you are 18, 16, whatever, to get an understanding of what type of information is coming there. And then with the data that the report laid bare, it's,
Mm.
young minds are preferencing these influencers or people sharing information over your classic institution, teacher, parent, or
Mhm.
caregiver. It's
Yeah. Let's talk about that content specifically. So I can give a little bit of a early kind of snapshot of some additional upcoming research that we have. That the report was obviously talking about masculinity influences, but we know that that isn't really the best metric for being able to really hone in on what are the granular elements of the content really that is capturing masculinity oriented themes. So, what we have done is we've looked at this is yet to be published research, but it is coming out soon. We've looked at TikTok feeds of young men to try to categorize the types of content, so the themes of masculinity oriented content. And we've identified three buckets.
Mhm.
The first that we're referring to as on ramps. This is men's lifestyle and culture content that covers topics and interest areas that we know young men are gravitating to. So, men's fashion, gaming, sports athletes, um, dating advice, and that they're kind of interest areas that we know are going to get clicks and attention and eyeballs from young men. The second category, this is really where we do start to, I guess, get more into what has traditionally been labeled manosphere content. The second category is all around how to and the importance of procuring masculine status. So that comes in a way of hyper masculine physiques or the muscular body image uh, type content. So your gym talk content, your weightlifting, bodybuilding type content, all around success, the importance of success, and how to, I guess, level up as a man in workplaces. How to, I guess, get the luxury car, the luxury watch, um, and the sub theme of gender roles. So, what kind of man should I be in my relationship, at work, in my community? And the last content category is more content that we know would violate TikTok's community guidelines, Instagram's community guidelines, YouTube's community guidelines, that degrades the health and well-being of men or others. Um,
Mhm.
and that is content that touches on suicide and self-harm, risk-taking behaviors, so depictions of binge drinking, gambling, steroid use, other drug use, and explicit misogyny or depictions of or advocating for violence towards others. So I think that that really helps start to define and delineate what content are we talking about here. When we talk about problematic content,
Yeah.
what is that content? Um, and what is your question around what is unique about this moment in time? Misogyny or very stereotypical ideas about masculinity that can restrict men's ideas or have advocate for very rigid ideas about what being a man looks like, and also the degrading health and well-being of self and others, so that risk-taking behaviors or the suicide and self-harm. These aren't new issues, unfortunately. These aren't new narratives, these aren't new ideologies. What is really new, or what is unique to this particular context of social media, is that young men are getting an immediate metric of others' agreeability. So rather than it just being an isolated voice in a family or an isolated member of a community sprouting some of these views that, you might roll your eyes at or start to think about how that opinion maybe sits or contradicts your own personal opinion. Young men are washed with likes, comments, share numbers that doesn't have a complementary metric. We don't see a dislike relative to the likes. We don't see uh, another person's algorithm relative to what ours is, and how the narratives or behaviors that we might be exposed to on our algorithm compares to somebody else's. So that's why it's unique at the moment.
Yeah, it's like trying to compare it, tell your parents what it looks like. Is, you had newspapers and maybe some shock jocks sitting on there, but you've just got a lot of shock jocks, and pretty unregulated shock jocks saying some wild things. It can stem from, I think you get into it in the report around spiraling content, and you speak to that with just those types of that study soon to come from TikTok
Mhm.
around those buckets of content and how people go through. So sort of curious in X, and then you see something on Y, and just it may start with something where you're just curious what that is, but because it's so enraging, shocking, or other, you stick with it and you get more fed to you, and it's pretty insidious for young impressionable people to be sort of fed that, to stay in there. And there's some, I hope people are aware of it, but yeah, with the rise of AI, there's different forms of content coming out. There's some horrible stories that have just been released of I think 3 young men who had been
Mm.
blackmailed with explicit content of
Mhm.
themselves, AI generated images, and they took their lives. So it's an absolute wild place to exist.
Yeah.
But
Well,
having said that, I think a lot of the youths are really quite clever from what I've seen
Mhm.
and heard around how to actually um, negotiate those algorithms.
Mhm.
Some fall outside of that, but it's pretty wild that we've left it up to them to sort of figure out how to work that blue sky of spoken, and try and change that with ways that you can lack of a better word, garden your own algorithm, get rid of the weeds, and sort of be
Mhm.
intentional with what pops up there. It hasn't fully taken off, but the model's really unique and interesting and gives a lot of power back. Um,
Young people know about this stuff, honestly, probably more than older people do. But also the algorithm is changing. You're right. Like the rise of AI, we don't know where that's going to be in a year's time, God forbid, 5 years' time.
mm,
So the difficulty sometimes is media literacy and algorithmic literacy that keeps up with the rapid changing nature of these spaces. And that's why it's so important for young people to, and hopefully product and tech developers to also be feeding into those media literacy programs or algorithmic literacy programs, because young people, number one, are using it way more than older generations are, who may be developing these programs or um, this this literacy. But also, when you get product developers involved, they can kind of see what is next more than somebody outside of the sector or outside of that space can.
that's such a valid point, Krista. Some good key partnerships where a bit of trust is there, and really getting that information out there. I'm
Mm.
keen to hear a little bit about your perspective on how to combat this. When we talk about sort of algorithmic literacy, AI literacy, we've been and emotional literacy, which all sit within sort of this sphere of what to do and how to do something. We've been working in the background with the program that's around sort of the agency gym, lack of a better word, play on. But keen to hear your thoughts on whether you play in the same space to serve information to kids and
Mm,
young men. Like, how do you combat that?
mhm,
And do you work within that business model that exists where you can go out and engage with influencers that have the trust of, like, for better or worse, have the
mhm,
trust of young men, and use that model that exists right now? Brands using it nonstop
mhm.
um, to sort of try to get a different counter narrative in there, or do you look to a whole new space to be able to, probably combination of all? That's where we're at the
Yeah,
moment. But I'm just curious to hear your perspective on how to play in that space, or whether it's a space that it's just
yeah.
a no
Oh,
go.
I'm excited to dive into this because this is all new territory. There aren't interventions yet that we can point to and know for certain with evidence that, yep, this has worked.
Mm,
Um, what we know is that we need to do something about it. Like that is a collective agreement that interventions are needed, but how to tackle it when there are limited resources, especially when we talk about like government funded programs or government funded interventions where there is appetite for doing more, our ability to change and the resources that we have available to us to instigate that change is limited. In an ideal world, it does need to be tackled in both ways.
mm,
Uh, it gets back to, I guess, why this content and potentially the more extreme content that is pushing misogynistic views that are promoting these very restrictive ideas about masculinity. The reason why it's resonating is because of the offline context that we're in. So, the fact that we're seeing a rise of mental illness in young men, the levels of loneliness are increasing at a rate, that we've never seen before, that there aren't really any very clear, tangible narratives around what good masculinity looks like, but the cost of getting it wrong and the notions and examples of bad masculinity or toxic, quote unquote, masculinity, which is a term that we don't like to use, but they are getting traction, they are rife. So it does need to be tackled in both ways because this problem exists online. So, as important or as worthy as something like school based interventions about social media are and school based education, especially on like AI generated child sexual material or something like that, as important as that is, the context is totally different. So we need to show up again in the places and spaces that young men are. And there is appetite to engage in mental health, in conversations about masculinity, because that is the content that young men are engaging with. So, I think working with influencers to try to shift the narrative is certainly an area that I think has great opportunity. When we look at other examples of counter narratives or de radicalization, for example, in white supremacists, that is a real extreme example, but that is something, an intervention or a counter narrative attempt that has been looked at and found to be effective in de radicalization. Actually, what shifted over time and what their intervention point was the more tangible changes in members of white supremacist communities' lives. So, paying for laser tattoo removal, for example, or helping them get jobs, not trying to combat the ideology head on. That those shifts in their ideological beliefs changed over time as their offline communities kind of counteracted or contradicted their beliefs that they had from these online spaces. So I think that there are absolutely ways to think about counter, or what I like to call alter narratives, that can address some of the reasons why the more restrictive or extreme masculinity oriented content is resonating with young men, which is that sense of uncertainty about the very unstable economic climate that we're in, the very real difficulties sometimes navigating like online dating and relationships, um, uh, difficulties sometimes leaving school, or starting in the workplace for the first time. There are ways that we can help them have or provide that information, that guidance, that community and connection that doesn't feed an amplification of rigid ideas about masculinity or extreme misogynistic views, that sees them, that helps empathize with them, but doesn't point or co-opt their frustrations in the way of someone else or another community.
Definitely needs like sounds like a corporate speak, but multi-pronged approach in terms of living there. And I think there's a young man shared his story in the report, Will's story, and that's really resonating with a lot of people around how he got out of that space, but he felt sort of very trapped because it gave him, a Big Mac solution to a very complex problem. It was very simple, easy steps to follow, and the content sort of was formulated to how to deal with some, inner and outer turmoil. And that was what you speak to around, financial situation, romantic situation. But it was pretty harrowing to read, but you could also understand that it's so common that it also isolated that young man so much, to the point where he was in, real danger by the sounds of things. It's such a big space, and I think touching on how you said it isn't different to what's past happened, but it's very different to where people are getting their information now, and that's what's, I think, the big challenge. Where we get our information and who we turn to is a real challenge. One cool example as well, which is just come out, and is that it's very simple, very trendy, but that piece where you call up your mate and you just say good night. It's an interesting one that takes off. So there's a real appetite to engage in sort of this, lack of a better word, softer side of masculinity and this playful nature, but there's this real desire to show care and what format that is. But it also gets clicks, and that's why people are jumping on it.
And I think any alter narratives or counter narratives that we look to partner on with influencers, that's why partnering with influencers is so important, because they do have that subject matter expertise on what is going to trend, how to, I guess, use the algorithm to your advantage, how to make the most of those viral moments. That is like critical when we think about trying to change like narratives in this space. You don't want just 10 young guys who are potentially already I guess believing or endorsing some of the narratives that you're going to push. You want it to reach a broader population. You want it to go mainstream in the way that some of these other masculinity influences are.
And I think it's the incentive for those masculinity influences, I think, is an interesting one. But I didn't get the data on who they are, but what's incentivizing them is fascinating, and that is, they're really working for themselves, but also to gain that and keep that attention. I think that real push to put out content, if you're thinking of them on that content production line, they're constantly trying to keep audience engaged, and they're looking at metrics that keep them engaged, and where and how. And often it's a repeatable format. You speak to influencers, you speak to content creators who are, monetizing their community through just engaging, however that is. A lot of them feel trapped in delivering the one key type and format of content that they have, and it worked well, and then they just stick at that, and then maybe get pushed in a certain way because that's where that friction, that's where that traffic jam has happened, and that traffic jam sells a lot more ads and keeps a lot more people on that space. I think that's what's always going to be the danger when we look to do counter narratives in this space, how that's going to play out, and how to use that model, and then also to have those moments offline to be that, have that combination of support that help that will to be able to get off and feel sort of heard and felt around physical connection. I think it's going to get more so with the rise of AI, but who knows? Everyone's got a crystal ball until they don't with that one.
Yeah. A really important point also to emphasize, I think, I was just thinking about it when you were talking about content creators and the influencer economy, is that they are also, a lot of the content they create is for a purpose of advertising in partnership with other businesses or corporate entities. So an important part of counter narratives or alter narratives would be also having other commercial entities or businesses that will get behind and partner with those influencers attempting to challenge like stereotypes or shift narratives on certain things. So for example, that trend of like calling your mates up to say goodnight, imagine a business like getting behind that and also like pushing and using their platform to also allow for some of those broader conversations about relationships or connection with mates. Like, yeah, I think that that's another really important component of this, is that there are bigger multi-million-dollar entities often that underlie and in some ways inflame these influencers' platforms, because they're also profiting off the young men who might be engaging with some of this content too.
100%. And it's a certain type, and you build a certain audience to be able to sell to that. And then when they're fully relying on it, they're sort of in that space. But I think there is real room to look to counter narratives and work with influence what that would look like for a counter narrative. You come with concepts, but how brands typically do that is, is that a big brand, suppose Eugene is an interesting, guy who works on the intersection of culture and brand. But yeah, it's phenomenal where people are heading on brands and they're really using influencers to reach their audience like never before. But the key is, it's sort of sad, but or I don't know, I don't want to label it too much, but it's an interesting world that we're in, because the whole brand piece is you've got to work with influencers very much how you would. It's almost got a little bit of co-design speak to it. So the way that you build a campaign is listen to their insight, if it's going to be effective, and listen to their insights and trust them to deliver and reinterpret what your brief is. When traditionally linear TV was very, very simple, and the touch points that went into that one campaign were very simple. But now to move a trend, it's got a million different ways to say it, because there's a million different or billions of different feeds that everyone's getting. And the people who really know, as you point out, are the ones who are delivering that information. And they only know a fraction of that feed. So how you intersect there is a really interesting way. And it'd be cool to see Movember play in that space.
Yeah,
I think
totally.
For a few reasons. I think it's a really, really well-trusted brand who are doing great work. And not enough brands are sort of leveraging that power there to change it. It's really being leveraged to sell. And then you've got a lot of trust. So the audience, the big friction that you see online is audience are always trying to pull up other creators or their creators, whether they're selling their audience out and what that looks like. And I think if you did it transparently with Movember, it's a really interesting space to explore to how to best do that and what that looks like. And then I think with the amazing research team, how you measure that impact you might be to be able to sift through and unearth some interesting blueprints that others can start to look towards.
Yeah, Absolutely. That's why any interventions or counter narratives, alter narratives, they must be co-designed with influencers who understand the social media landscape, who understand how to use the algorithm to your advantage, what partnerships opportunities look like with other key brands who do this really well in this space, and co-designed with their audiences, which are young men.
Mm,
Um, they're the subject matter experts in this space. So yeah,
yeah.
totally right.
And that leads to this piece. Like, I think it'd be really cool to see what young men want in that space. I'm yet to see. We're sort of heading into the next stage of like what agency builders looks like, and we're forming
Mm,
some questions up to ask young men what they would like to see as counter narrative, or what they would like to see, shared, what information they feel like is missing, or really to get that picture to design a pilot that looks the
mhm,
scale to be able to ambitiously hit a national sort of note to help swing this a little bit and give some
mm,
information, because there's a real disconnect. You said at the top of the call, with the trust has been corroded. Sort of institutions who traditionally had knowledge still have a lot of that knowledge, but that knowledge is being less and less. It's never been more easy to interact with it, but
mhm.
because of the volume of information out there now and the different types of content, it's never been less interacted with. So
Yep.
there's this real strange contradiction now, and I think there's room to be able to get that synergy going. Maybe there's three players there around how that information is developed with the kids who need that, the
Yep.
institutions who have a lot of that, and then maybe the influences is how it's delivered. But I think we
Mm,
really need to hit and speak to the kids, like, what does that look like, whether they have those answers or not. But interested to hear what you would
mm.
approach there.
That distrust in institutions is really interesting. And you're right, it is there is a growing distrust amongst young people, but also especially young men in
Mm-hmm.
traditional institutions. To me, I'm like, how can we use that in a way that helps challenge the institution or the broader models that are social media companies, platforms, big tech? I know that that's not a traditional institution, but they are making money and benefiting off the downfall of young men's health by being on these platforms. So I think we can use that, and we can think about how can we undermine potentially some of the harmful business models, or even ways of like calling upon big tech and social media platforms to bring the black box that is algorithms into public discourse a little bit more, to help make things that are currently not transparent. Um, so yeah, I really like to think about that in some ways, where how can we use that critical thinking, that distrust, that empowerment in a way that then applies for this current social media context and the young men's digital worlds. And
Mm.
I think that there's an assumption, or it's something that I hear a lot when we talk about young people and social media, is that there is a lack of willingness to change, or a kind of dismissal of what older people or health professionals may point to as like the harmful elements of social media. So you spend too much time online, you know all you do is talk to people on your phones, and I don't know who you're talking to. Young people, and young men especially, we've got data on this, they want more control of their algorithm. They want to have an ability to curate their feed more. Um, the majority don't like this toxic content that they are seeing on their social media feeds. But currently, there isn't accessible enough or tangible enough ways through the systems that are these digital spaces and products like algorithms to actually empower them to do that. And there is real opportunity, I think, in campaigns or interventions that help young men encourage more conscious or intentional social media use behaviors. So, helping them or the public understand that there are ways to reset your platforms, that there are ways to curate your feeds so that you can see more of certain content that you like and that makes you feel good, that you laugh at and share with your friends, but can minimize some of the other um, more toxic shit that you don't like. So when we can help them actually understand what is available to them, when we can make intentional and conscious social media use more closely linked to self optimization, health and well being, which are narratives that young men are engaging with online.
Mm.
All of this, like procuring masculine status content, is about how to level up as a man. And often that is like the eyes bars, the meditation, the journaling. They're actually beneficial for health in a lot of ways, like when they aren't used in restrictive and rigid ways. So those narratives are there, but we can just use them in a different way of, hey, spending all this time on social media is taking you away and distracting you from all of the other things that can make your health and your life better. And it isn't something that I've seen social media influencers in these masculinity spaces do or push because it would undermine their business models. So I think that that's actually a really cool thing that I definitely want to look to and explore more in the future.
Yeah, I love that. I really like your perspective on just using those existing sort of wants, needs, and that move agency to sort of be better, but what that actually could look like with different insights behind it, I think is really cool. For me, listening to it, I feel like that has to live offline. I've seen it online in different spaces where, and it gives me a gag reflex because there's people that you see and there's a trend. I don't know if you've come across it, but online where people like get off your phone, and it's bizarre because you build trust with them, but then there's also like, why are
Mm.
you telling me that? That sort of sucks because I feel like you're just trying to tell me to get off my phone. So I'm like, oh, you've got my back, but then they're still delivering online. It's a really
Yeah.
sticky, strange little spot, that one. But the intention behind it, I think, is really strong. The algorithm never backs it unless it's proven the numbers to stick you around. But I like the tax
Yeah.
on attention is a really interesting one.
Mm.
I think governments
And
and
look, the world is digitally connected. I don't think we can ever purely be offline now. Like, even at work, I'm connected all the time. So, if it's not social media in a young person's world, it is going to
be
catch up
something.
with them later on in their professional worlds anyway. And I'm hoping that, we will, and it's not the same thing, but I just mean, like, our societies are digitally connected. We have already gotten to that place. We can't reverse the clock unless there is a global wide and population wide shift. But what I do think we can do and show up with online is those techniques and suggestions and really tangible strategies for more intentional social media use. If you know this is the type of content that makes you feel good, if this is what you want from social media, to connect with people, to be seen, to have guidance and information, you can have that, and we can help you craft your algorithm to feed you that, but forego the other stuff that isn't going to make you feel good in the long run, isn't actually serving you in the way that you think it is, or is just giving clicks and attention and time to influencers who don't always have your intentions at heart or who are profiting off you. And not just influencers, but also these, multi-billion dollar big tech companies as well.
Yeah, 100, can't forget them. And you could really see that program work well if you got, you know, kids who are willing to sort of explore those methods and show that real impact, I think that's when it starts to land, when people see others really start to have those benefits and see that curatorial effect, what that looks like. I think there's a lot already doing that. But yeah, how you make that a bit more of a repeatable, scalable form of, I don't know, education / entertainment, what that looks like, whether it's a trend, how to be in that space in a way
Yeah.
that's, authentic and speaks many different sub languages or subcultures. I think that's a real challenge, and one that Movember's actually well placed to do.
Yeah.
I could
And that
chat to you.
intersection between, I was going to say, to finish up, that intersection between education and entertainment is vital, and it needs to be aspirational. If we don't have those three key elements, it will not crack through. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, it really won't, and I think that's what I get really excited about the challenge, because it's there, and there's ways to think about this differently and do something. And we've got to be, brave enough to try things and understand that they might fail. I think that's also the challenge with young kids across the board, is they're pretty scared to fail. So if others aren't sort of showing up and being, trying and being okay with failing, then how are they? I think that would be another side note there. A really interesting piece of content or trend is showing that failure is beautiful. I think is a big one for young men to see, young kids to see in general. It's pretty prevalent, but we could go for a while on that side quest. But I look forward to
We need to
keeping
have
the
a
conversation.
follow-up episode and dive into all the other things, because my mind is, certainly firing.
Yeah, I feel like there's a few things that could be to put out there. I think we have to pick this one up, let people get off their pods and get out into the real world, whatever that may be these days. I catch myself saying that. I feel like I'm about 80 years old when I say the real
I
world.
know, we're not. We're still in that, young person
Yeah,
age range.
yeah. Dr. Krista Fisher, it's been an absolute pleasure. Looking forward to already having you back on the show, but thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. It was a great conversation.